Okay, it's 6 o'clock. It looks like there's a lot of people logging on right now. So, but I think we can probably get started. COVID, soon there a COVID-19 vaccine is going to be available in Arizona, which is fabulous news. But given the impact that COVID-19 has had on Black, Latinx, and Native American communities, it's really going to be critical to provide evidence-based information to those communities. And physicians and healthcare providers like you all, obviously, as you know, play a critical role in partnering with your patients as they make personal and family healthcare decisions. And tonight is about giving you information that you need so that you are confident in your decision to receive the COVID-19 vaccine when it's available to you, and so that you will recommend it to your patients. So at TAPI, we believe you are the key to protecting our community from vaccine preventable diseases, including COVID-19, and especially our hard to reach populations and our communities that are impacted by lots of systemic and structural inequities that impact their health. So TAPI is really happy to provide you with this kind of education today. We are your state vaccine coalition. We are a public-private partnership. We have over 400 coalition members, and a lot of you partner with us to meet our mission to foster community wellness and advocate for good public policy and best immunization practices. So this is what we do, is give you information so that you can really partner with your patients to be able to fix all of our problems and protect us from all the diseases. So we are really excited to have, we were joking when we opened the line today saying we have the vaccine dream team. So we have 3 of our very long time TAPI partners and steering committee members. Dr. Rebecca Sonnenschein from Maricopa County Department of Public Health is going to kick us off today with some information about COVID-19 and health equity. Then Dr. Karen Lewis from the Department of Health Services she is our state expert on COVID-19 vaccines. So she's going to give you all that you need to know about that vaccine science. And then we're going to close out with Dr. Bob England, the former director at Maricopa and Pima County Department of Public Health. And he's going to help us start thinking about how to talk with patients now while they're still waiting for access to the vaccine. So we have about at least 10 minutes between each of our presenters today for discussion. And as your state coalition, we really need to hear from you. You're so busy right now in clinic and doing so much in our communities. And we really see tonight as an opportunity to hear from you about how you think we can help address inequities in our community, make sure that things that happened in communities, especially Black, Latinx, and Native American communities that happened with testing do not happen with equitable distribution for our vaccine. So we really want to hear your feedback. And we also want to hear just what your concerns are to receive the vaccine so that we can continue to educate other providers and do our part. So I say that to say, please unmute yourselves during the question and answer parts because we really do want to hear from you. So no questions are off limits. All right. Well, Rebecca, why don't you kick us off and talk about health equities? And I don't know if you need to also say who you are. We have people from all over the state, so some people might not know who you are.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So I'm Rebecca Sonnenschein. I'm the Medical Director for Disease Control at Maricopa County Public Health. So the local data I show you is going to be a little bit Maricopa-centric, but I show you a few examples of everything. So know that it really does apply to all. All right, ready to start? There we go. So we're going to talk about health equity and COVID-19 vaccination. And really, I want you to walk away with a good understanding of the data and that these health disparities really do exist. And then I have plenty of data to show you what the reason for those health disparities are, although I could never show it all to you. And then I have a relatively recent picture of vaccine acceptance in the community that I think really lays the groundwork for the work that we have to do coming ahead. Next slide, please. So I want to start off by saying that even though we're talking about race and ethnicity disparities, please remember that all severe disease, hospitalization, admission to an intensive care unit, and death, all of this increases with age and with increasing numbers of comorbidities in COVID-19. So when you're talking about any race or ethnicity, people who are older and who have comorbidities are always going to be even more disproportionately affected. And you can see there that line, the top dashed line in blue, 65 plus, shows a much higher rate per 100,000 population of hospitalizations than all of the other age groups. Next slide, please. So this is a chart that is really complicated, but I want you not to look at all those numbers. I want you really just to focus on that bottom row. And what it is US hospitalization rate per 100,000 by age, race, and ethnicity. This is from March through the end of November 2020. Slide, please. So I want you to hone in on that one there in the corner. That's your reference rate, which is non-Hispanic whites. Next slide. And what you can see is when you look at non-Hispanic American or Alaskan Natives, you can see that their rate of hospitalization is almost 4 times that of whites. Non-Hispanic Blacks is just over 3 times that of whites, and Hispanic or Latinos is almost 4 times that of whites. So what we are looking at is health disparities in all people of color relative to whites when it comes to severe disease from COVID-19. Next slide, please. So this, there's a lot more data out there about COVID-19 with Black persons. So I do have more data to share on that, but we know this exists with Native Americans. If they're smaller populations, it's not studied as much. But this is an example of the disproportionate amount of deaths among Blacks compared to whites in the United States. You can see that Blacks represent 13% of the US population, yet they represent 25% of the deaths. So very much disproportionately represented among COVID-19 deaths. Next slide, please. This is some local data here in Maricopa County. And on the left side, we're looking at race and ethnicity case rates per 100,000 persons. And that top, can I ask everyone to mute your lines, please? Great. So that top line represents American Indian or Alaskan Native cases, and you can see how much longer it is compared to that third line, which represents whites. And then next is the rate per 100,000 of African American or Black cases per 100,000. So you can see that both of those groups are disproportionately represented among cases. Now, if you go to the right side of the chart, that's looking at hospitalization rates, and you can see American Indian and Alaskan Natives are very much disproportionately represented, and we see that here in Arizona. We know the issues that we've had among the Navajo Nation. You don't hear as much about the tribes in Maricopa County. We've also experienced much more cases and more severe outbreaks in community with a lot of Native American residents. And you can see that Black or African Americans also have a higher rate of hospitalization here in Maricopa County compared to whites. Next slide, please. So looking at deaths in Maricopa County, you can see that on the left on the circle is, ooh, and I can't quite see that side of the slide, is the proportion of American Indians and African Americans of Maricopa County. And you can see that when you look at the death rates, they are much higher than the proportion of the population. So again, a lot more people of color are dying from COVID-19 than are others. Next slide, please. So here's ethnicity. In case you think I'm too focused on race, you can see that being Hispanic or Latino, they represent 31% of the population. However, they represent 46% of cases and about 41% of hospitalizations and deaths. Next slide, please. We also know, and this was a recent article that just came out, and this shows that people of color actually even have different exposures to COVID-19 relative to white people, and that people of color are more likely to be exposed in their household, and that tends to be because there's more people living in the household, often multi-generational households, and also in their non-healthcare work setting. I think what was really notable on this slide, two things. One is that the Hispanic and Latinx population had 29% who had exposures in their non-healthcare workplace compared to 22% in white. That really stood out to me, those workplace exposures. And then if you look at healthcare, I circled that one. For some reason, Blacks have 50% more exposures in healthcare than whites do. And I found that very interesting. Next slide, please. So why do these disparities exist? I think everyone on this call knows this, that the social determinants of health are the reason. There's the racial wealth gap, housing and living conditions, increased occupational risk. Fewer people of color have health insurance than others, and these groups tend to have more chronic medical conditions. And this is just a few examples of social determinants of health. Of course, there are many more, but all of these factors lead to people of color having overall fewer resources to adjust to the social and economic disruption from COVID-19. So now I'm just going to put some examples up of how we know this is true. This is not just theory. Next slide, please. So this is a really good series looking at Blacks compared to whites, looking at cash reserves. And what you can see is that whites have much more cash reserves, and that's even when you account for college education, home ownership, and other factors. Whites tend to have a lot more cash reserves than Blacks, and that is a main reason why if Blacks lose their jobs or something else happens to disrupt their financial stability, they just don't have the same reserves. And this figure B that was recently published shows a direct or an inverse relationship between the probability of getting COVID and median household income in the neighborhood. So the wealthier the neighborhood, the less likely you are to get COVID-19, and that's actually been demonstrated in US data. Next slide, please. This is just an example among Native Americans. In 2016, we know that 12.7% of the general population lived below the poverty line, whereas almost 30% of Native Americans live below the poverty line. So we know that they are always disproportionately, they have fewer economic resources to start with. Next slide, please. We all know that there's health disparities among Latinx populations. And it goes for all of the different groups. I put an example from an article up here. It's 40% of Mexican Americans, 26% of Cubans, 21% of Puerto Ricans do not have health insurance compared to 16% of whites. So fewer cash reserves, fewer resources, and if they do get sick, people of color are less likely to have health insurance, so that can just set them completely off financial stability if they get a big healthcare bill. And this is especially a pronounced problem among immigrants, which obviously in Arizona we have a lot of Latinx immigrants. Next slide, please. We talked about occupational risk a little bit, but this is just one example that was done. The percentage of workers in essential sectors who are African American from 2014 to 2018. So someone said, seems like old stats. These are the stats that I could find that were most recent related to essential workers. It doesn't mean they are the most recent stats, but what this shows you is that Blacks make up 13% of the US population, but when you look at essential workers, and all of them tend to have high exposures to the public and others, they're all well above 13%. So they disproportionately serve in these high-risk occupations that have high amounts of exposures and are also essential, so they have to continue working during the pandemic. And then this was a recent study showing that Black workers are less likely to have paid sick leave and less likely to be able to work from home than white workers. And of course, being able to work from home is one of the biggest protective factors during the pandemic. Next slide, please. We also see that Blacks are more likely to have chronic medical conditions, and I think one of two of the really important ones that you'll hear about, diabetes. We know that puts you at much higher risk for severe disease from COVID, 17% in Blacks versus 10% in whites. And severe obesity is also a major risk factor for severe disease. That's 50% among Blacks versus 42.2%. And if we were looking at Native American statistics, they would look very similar. So health disparities in these populations put them at much higher risk for severe disease, and they are much less likely to be able to recover financially once they're hit. Next slide. This is just another slide that I found, and this is definitely old data, but it was hard to find one specifically for Latinx populations and diabetes, but they are much more likely to die from diabetes than are other populations. So again, showing those major COVID-19 risk factors all being higher in people of color. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to end with this. Just came out fairly recently where they looked at the vaccine acceptance among different groups for the COVID-19 vaccine. And it's such a tiny little graph, but these data aren't all over the place. But the Pew Research Center, I think, is a pretty reliable source. And what you can see in that tiny little graph on the top middle is that you've got much higher vaccine acceptance rates in the low 70s among whites and Hispanics. But when you look at Blacks, it's actually less than half. So here we have a population who is more at risk financially, more at risk for severe illness, and is much less likely to take the vaccine, which is really the only tool that we have that is going to sort of get us out of this pandemic. So I think that really lays out the work that we have to do. We know that trust in government is not at its height right now, and I think that's an understatement. So we have a lot of work to do to get folks believing in the process, understanding the process. I know Dr. Lewis will talk about it more. I'm hoping she'll present the data here in Arizona, but one of the things that ADHS did find is that people trust their personal physicians most of all. So more so than CDC, more so than public health, they trust you, their personal physicians. So primary care physicians have a huge role in convincing their patients to get the COVID-19 vaccine, which I really think is going to be the way that we get our lives back to normal. And I'll turn it over back to Rebecca.
All right, and I'd like to ask anyone who has a question for Dr. Sonnenschein, if you want to, you can unmute yourself and ask that verbally, or you can chat things in. And while someone's getting their courage to unmute and ask a question, there are a couple in the chat too, if you want to take a peek.
So Asians it says Asians have 32% development of COVID compared to 22% of whites. Do we have theories for that? I'll say that's not reflected in Maricopa County data. And I honestly When I was looking at the data, I didn't see the same health disparities among Asians as I did among others. But for whoever chatted that, I would love to hear what they think. Anybody willing to talk about that?
I was the one who
Okay.
brought that up, and that was the household transmissions that we were looking at that graph back before. I have any like big theories, unless it's just because they tend to bring more of their families here and are living in a smaller home. I'm not sure.
Okay, now, so these weren't actually transmissions. These are exposure settings. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, I wonder if that's because, and this is just a guess, because of multi-generational households. I think there are cultural things where Asians often have their parents living with them. And I do wonder if having all the people in the family and having people who are older and at higher risk in the family with kids going to school might make them more likely to be exposed in the home. And I do know that that is a risk factor among Native Americans as well. And I've seen it for Hispanics and Blacks. So that's the only guess I have.
Thank you. Another question is, considering the numbers involved in the populations of color, are there any plans in place that you may be aware of to inform these populations?
Well, yes, I will speak for Maricopa County. Dr. Nick Staub, who has just been instrumental and helped with these slides and is helping with all of our vaccine efforts, we're putting together sort of a health disparities and vaccine roadshow. It's a general vaccine roadshow, but it includes health disparities. And our goal is to try and outreach populations, particularly ones that have more vulnerable populations and people of color. So he's already communicated with an interfaith group several times to help educate clergy and other members of the faith community so that they could reach the people in their congregations and help explain to them the importance of getting the vaccine. We are working with a group at Banner called White Coats for Black Lives, and their mission is, as Black resident physicians, they want to reach out to the Black community and explain to them the importance of getting the vaccine. So we're working with them. We're going to share our slides with a lot of different partner groups that we have, particularly other physicians who want to go out and spread the word. So if you are interested as any healthcare provider, any group, and we find that people tend to listen to their own group. So nurses are the best at convincing nurses. And it just seems to work that way. So anybody who wants to borrow our slide set, maybe even make it better, and go out there and give a presentation to your peers and other people in your community, we would love you to partner with us.
Great, thanks. And if you're from outside Maricopa County, and you would want to do something in your community, they help other counties too. So
anybody can have the slides. We'll even help you get the data from your county.
Right. I'd love to hear too, I know that we want to make sure that we get into the vaccine science with Dr. Lewis, but we were curious to hear from you how your ideas on how to address health disparities in healthcare. So what are things that you feel like you all can do in your clinics day to day? Are there ideas that you can share with one another? Are there things that we can help support you with? So any thoughts on that, we'd love to hear.
Jennifer Miller says, get the vaccine yourself.
Yay, yes. That's like our number one ask today is as soon as you can get it, get it. And I appreciate too, Dr. Irizarry saying Spanish speaking media. And if that's something that you really feel passionate about, we are always looking for Spanish speaking physicians and nurses and physician assistants to, when we get asked by the Spanish speaking media. So please chat in your name if you're willing to help us with that, and we can connect with you later. And I'd also say that there is some conversation about who is a trusted provider. And, you know, this is geared towards physicians and all healthcare providers. Every community, every healthcare provider is the trusted provider of the patients you have a relationship with. So it's not about one group being more trusted than another. We need you all. All right. Well, as you digest some of that data, you know, the good thing about data is when we know it and we keep continuing to see it, we do get agency to do something about it. And really, these inequities, none of us are surprised that these inequities look like this, given the patients that you all see and partner with every day. So we really would like to just get ideas from you about what can we do so that the next pandemic, it's not like this. We really do feel like there's a lot of agency in the community to do things differently now. So anything you think we can do to help. And I think it's time to talk about the vaccine science. And I'm going to first launch a poll. So if you'll see this poll question pop up on your box, click all of the statements that you agree with. This is the same question that we've been asking our medical assistants when we do trainings, our medics, and now we're asking this group. So please select all of the options that you agree with. And I'll give you all just maybe 10 more seconds for this. And there's a lot of options, so go ahead and scroll down to see them all. All right, I'm gonna end the poll right now. And we'll share the results just so you all can see what your peers and colleagues think. So most people on the line are saying if CDC says it's good, then I'm good. I'll make sure that I get that COVID-19 vaccine. And, you know, if my own doctor or nurse or healthcare provider says that I should get it, then I'll listen to them too. So we just think it's interesting to ask, and different groups kind of fall into different categories. So, but I'm going to introduce Dr. Lewis, and Dr. Lewis, just go ahead and take it away. And if you want to tell me to move the slides forward, then I'll do that.
Let's get started. I have learned about vaccines, the different manufacturers of vaccines, and because of that, I feel very comfortable with many of these vaccines. There's over 200 institutions working on vaccines right now, and I just want to go through about the 10 different vaccines that are being in clinical trials right now in the US. Next slide. Okay, you've all seen this spike protein, and there's a colorized electron microscope picture showing the COVID interacting with the cell, and it's these spike proteins that connect with an acetylcholinesterase receptor on the cell, allowing the virus to enter the cell. And so all of the vaccines are focused on developing antibodies and cellular immunity to those spike proteins. Next. people say, how in the world have we been able to get a vaccine so quickly? It's a combination of a lot of things. Research that was started with SARS, the first SARS and Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, that could be built on. Resources, the federal government gave promising pharmaceutical companies financial assistance so that they were able to do a lot of the necessary steps in parallel rather than sequential. For example, normally after doing their humongous efficacy studies, they then get FDA approval, and then they would start making vaccines. And it would take 6 months, a year, 2 years, I mean, to build up a lot of vaccines. But vaccines have been manufactured in the millions so that there's vaccines that are ready to go off the shelf as soon as there is emergency use authorization by the FDA. The shortest FDA approval up to this point has been 3.5 months. Pfizer submitted November 20th. They had the VRBPAC meeting today, which is a committee for FDA, and we can possibly get, and they voted positive, 77% said yes, approve this Pfizer vaccine for 16 years and above. And so we very well could get an EUA for the Pfizer vaccine this weekend. And also collaboration on government level. CDC, Department of Defense, has been helping to build ancillary kits to go along with the vaccine, and military with their logistics getting the vaccine out. And scientific advances in making vaccines. All of these have contributed. The important scientific steps have not been jumped over, but a lot of the bureaucratic red tape has. Next slide. I'm going to talk about messenger RNA COVID vaccines, and this will apply to both Pfizer and Moderna. This is a Pfizer diagram. But the exciting scientific advance is that as soon as the virus was identified, or soon after the virus was identified, in early January, scientists in the US were able to get the genome of the virus and figure out within a fairly short time what part of that RNA coded for the spike protein. And when they figured that out, they were able to start making this vaccine without having to wait for the virus to grow over months. They're able to start getting this vaccine, but it's fragile. So they envelop it in a lipid nanoparticle, and it's so tiny, it can just slip into the pores of the cell and tell the cell, make spike protein, just spike protein, not make the whole virus, just make the spike protein. The spike protein then goes up to the surface of the cell, next slide, and sticks out, and then, oh, this is foreign. We've never seen this before. Let's make antibodies, T cells, helper cells. Let's start responding to this foreign invader. And so that's why, you know, Pfizer has said, and Moderna have had about 95% efficacy, because it is good at teaching the body how to respond, be prepared to fight against something that comes in with spike protein on it. Next. So Pfizer, they're both a little different, both 2-dose, and they have to be, they're not interchangeable. Pfizer, you can give, it needs to be a minimum of 21 days. What if somebody just is slow and doesn't come back until 30 days? Fine, you don't have to start over again. It comes as multi-dose vials, but it comes in big trays. And so it a minimum of at least close to 1,000 doses. And it needs ultra low temperature storage. And so it comes in these big shippers with dry ice. And then once it gets thawed, it can be okay in the refrigerator for up to 5 days. But then once you're ready to use it, and you dilute it, it has to be used within 6 hours. So because of these logistics, these are more easily used in where there are large populations and you can get 1,000 people immunized in a short amount of time. Next slide. And there is no maximum. You don't have to restart the series over again. If somebody gets 1 dose of Pfizer and then doesn't come back for another year, just give that 2nd dose of Pfizer. And I'm going to show you some of the immunology. This is just from the efficacy data that showed, I don't have the pretty red circles. Next time I'll do it like Dr. Sunshine. But they found that if you look at 3 lines down, the number of cases between the Pfizer vaccine and the placebo, how many cases of coronavirus were diagnosed. If you look at the number after dose 1 to before dose 2, there was 50% efficacy. But if you look from dose 2 to 7 days after, all of a sudden you hardly had any cases. In the Pfizer vaccine recipients, you were up to 90% efficacious. And so after 7 days after dose 2, close to 95% efficacious. So after 1 dose, about 50% protection. 2 doses, 95%. That's as good as measles vaccine, 1 dose of measles vaccine. So that's really good. Next slide. I'm going to use Moderna, some of Moderna's immunologic tests graphs to show you what to expect in terms of reactogenicity and immunologic response, because I didn't have Pfizer's presentations available to me, but Moderna has its presentation up on the ACIP website, so I'm going to be using that. But Moderna, they studied it with 2 doses, 28 days apart. It comes in boxes of 10 vials, 10 doses per vial. So it's much easier to use for smaller practices in the rural areas. And it's a frozen vaccine, but it doesn't need dry ice and it doesn't need to be diluted. Next slide. And this is again from the ACIP presentation, little tiny, but gray is mild reaction, turquoise is moderate, and yellow is severe reaction. And then it has on each of these different rows, it has age groups. 18 to 55, 56 to 70, 70 and above. And on the bottom, it has a percentage of response. And then it has vaccine column 1, vaccination column 2. And the systemic reactions are on the left side and the first 2 lines of the right side, and then there's local reactions. So if you look, there are very few systemic reactions after the first dose, more so after the 2nd dose. More arthralgias, fatigue, fever, a little bit of fever, chills, headache, myalgia, little nausea, but moderate, mild, hardly any severe. And then with local reactions, same thing. It's basically, most people have pain at the vaccination site. Next slide. We don't know how long this vaccine will give protection, and that's going to have to be studied. Vaccine safety challenges are guiding how we test for safety in these vaccines. With respiratory syncytial virus vaccine, there was a vaccine-enhanced respiratory disease. The infants who got vaccinated actually, then when they were exposed to RSV, got worse, and actually, unfortunately, 2 died. They found on autopsy on those 2 children that the airways, the mucous membranes were extremely swollen and narrowed, and a lot of eosinophils, consistent with an allergic response. And their helper cells, or CD4 cells, had what they called a T helper type 2 bias, which you see with allergic responses. And so with any vaccine going forward after that, testing for, make sure that it's a Th1 response. Then with dengue vaccine, that's a terrible disease, and this dengue vaccine really seemed to give good antibodies and give protection. And then they realized that very young children actually got sicker after they got the dengue vaccine, and they realized because they didn't have antibodies, ones that were small, had never had one of the 4 dengue strains before, and for some reason then the vaccine caused them, yes, they made antibodies, but they weren't neutralizing antibodies. So I will show you with the Moderna, next slide, what they did in terms of looking at neutralizing antibodies. And the pink area is the range of convalescent serum. The left side is a titer. And then they actually have 3 segments up on top, again, 18 to 55 years old, 56 to 70, then 70 and above. And then the gray columns show responses, antibody responses. So day 1, an 18 to 55-year-old, nothing. Day 15, 2 weeks after the first injection, half of the people were up in the range of convalescent serum. And so a month later, same, they got the second dose, and then subsequently, they all had high antibody levels. With the 56 to 70-year-old, they didn't test after the first dose, but after the second dose, high levels. The 71 and above, same thing. After 1 dose, their antibodies, some of them were up in the convalescent serum, but after the second dose, they all were high, comparable to convalescent serum. And these are neutralizing antibodies. Next slide. And then this shows the helper cell response, and the Th1 response for the 3 age groups at day 1, day 29, and then day 43. And the red is any Th1 response, and the blue is interferon, the green is interleukin-2, the orange is tumor necrosis factor, and as you can see by day 43, they, even after the first month, they were having some percentage of the helper cells were showing a Th1 phenotype, but definitely by day 43, there's quite a strong response. And they did not present any data on Th2 because there were hardly any CD4 counts that showed a Th2 bias, also very promising. Next slide. I'm going to go through other vaccines that are coming down the pike, so you can see what's coming and the science behind all of them. They're different platforms, and the question was, we've got to do different vaccines because maybe some will work and maybe some won't, and we need to see what the best ones are. The AstraZeneca uses what they call a non-replicating viral vector. It uses a chimpanzee adenovirus, which is a DNA virus. It doesn't make humans sick. And they took DNA that codes for the spike protein and they spliced it into the chimp adenovirus. Now, the thing about this adenovirus being non-replicating is they actually chopped off some of the DNA of the chimpanzee so that the virus can get into a cell, can replicate, but it can't get out of the cell. And normally viruses get into the cell, replicate, lots of viruses go out, they just invade more cells and more cells, but this can't get out of the cell. But with that DNA from SARS-CoV-2, it also makes spike protein, and the spike protein goes to the cell membrane and says, hi, immune cells, come and look at me. Again, just another way to get spike protein manufactured in cells. Next slide. Janssen uses a very similar model. This looks the same, doesn't it? Well, it's virtually the same type of platform. They use a human adenovirus, I think it's 26, and they splice the SARS-2 DNA for spike protein into this non-replicating adenovirus, gets into the cell, it replicates, the adenovirus doesn't get out, the spike protein goes to the cell surface, boom, the immune system is initiated. Next slide. Novavax also is in phase 3 right now, clinical studies. Both AstraZeneca and Janssen are in phase 3, which is where they're doing the 30,000 double-blinded study. Novavax uses spike proteins with an adjuvant. And that's kind of more standard vaccine development. The spike protein is made by an insect virus, baculovirus, and then they splice the RNA for the spike protein into the virus. The virus then infects army worm cells, and then it grows and grows and grows. And as the virus grows in these cells, happily, it also makes lots of spike protein. Spike proteins are harvested, adjuvant is combined. This vaccine is, should be stored at in refrigerators, and will take 2 doses. Next slide. Medicago just barely started into phase 3. This is a viral-like particle vaccine with an adjuvant. You go, what's a viral-like particle? Have you ever heard of the human papilloma virus vaccine? It is a viral-like particle vaccine, which it's the outer coat of, they splice the DNA for the HPV external proteins into yeast, and then the yeast happily replicates, making the HPV proteins, and that recombine and look just like the virus. This is a little different in that it uses plant-based technology, I believe tobacco plants, and they splice in the DNA that codes for the external proteins of COVID, but there's no internal RNA. This is expected to be refrigerator temperature, 2 doses, but it looks just like the virus, and so the immune system will say, well, let's react. Next slide. See, all of these are interesting new ways of delivering the stimulation to make antibodies and cellular immunity to the spike protein. Inovio is DNA vaccine. It has a circular plasmid that codes for the spike protein, but DNA is larger. It's harder to get into cells than the tiny mRNA. And so they use a device called, Selectra. Anyway, they use electroporation. That's a new word for everybody probably. But what it is the device, in addition to giving the vaccine, gives a little electrical pulse at the same time. And that transiently opens the pores in the cells so the DNA plasmid can get in. This is DNA stable, quite stable. And so this is expected to be stable at room temperature for a year, but requiring 2 doses. Next slide. Sanofi is working on a recombinant spike protein, also using baculovirus platform with an adjuvant, and it's working on a messenger RNA vaccine. Next slide. Vaxart is making an oral vaccine using a non-replicating human adenovirus 5 with adjuvant, and it's in phase 1 right now, but it is stable at room temperature, which is wonderful for areas that do not have a cold chain. It requires, it's being tested, but it looks like it requires 2 doses. Next slide. And finally, Merck has developed using a measles virus, has spliced in RNA for the SARS spike protein, and they're looking to see if just 1 dose or 2 doses are needed. Merck is also working with a recombinant vesicular stomatitis virus vaccine. The vesicular stomatitis virus is a disease of cows, but that has been used successfully in creating an Ebola virus vaccine. And again, splicing the RNA into this virus and using that as the vector. Next slide. This is where we are in the timetable for getting COVID. I do have a pretty red circle there. We're just going to be at the very limited number of vaccines. It's going to rapidly surge. By the middle of June, it's expected there could be as much as 600 million doses of COVID vaccines in the United States. And next slide. This is, I didn't have time to go into the survey that just got completed at the State Health Department, but this is one of the summary messages, is that the most effective messengers are doctors and physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, healthcare providers, also those who have already taken the vaccine. So those of you that feel comfortable taking the vaccine, I will, as soon as I can get my hands on it or my arm into it or whatever. But you're being able to say, I've had the vaccine. Yes, I did fine with the first dose. I had a little more reaction for the second dose. Anyway, to be able to say, I've taken the vaccine is also another important way of encouraging your patients as you advise them about the vaccine. Next slide. the safety looks very good in clinical testing, but 30,000 people, or actually 15,000 since it's blinded, isn't enough to pick up real rare illnesses. So we need to do post-approval monitoring, although the vaccines, if you see them, they're so much more pure. They're so much more, more targeted, much less overall antigen going into the body. I'd be very surprised if there's more side effects than the other vaccines that we're using now, but we'll have to see with time. Of course, using providers should report any significant event after COVID vaccine, even if you don't think it's related. In addition, there's a vaccine safety data link that's a surveillance program that's already set up, in which the CDC works with healthcare organizations that cover about 3% of the population, and using the electronic health record can in almost real time compare the vaccines in question with other illnesses. You know, because people have heart attacks and they have strokes and they have pneumonias, and so seeing if there's any relation between the vaccine and the illness. And finally, they will be asking all the providers to, in addition to, of course, giving the emergency use authorization to the patient, to also give them a handout about something called Be Safe, which talks to them about registering with the CDC in order to daily tell the CDC. They'll get texts and the CDC will ask, how are you doing? Are you having a fever? Does your arm hurt? And they can just say, yeah, this is what's going on with me. So for a week of daily input, texting, and then weekly for another 6 weeks. And finally, for those of you that want to give vaccines but haven't signed up yet, you can onboard at the ACIS homepage. That's Arizona State Immunization Information System, or Electronic Vaccine Registry. That's the link, but you can also just search for ACIS vaccine, ACIS home, and it'll take you right to the homepage. And on the homepage, you'll see this big onboarding declaration, and the red cap link is down there, but it's easier just remembering ACIS. Okay, and Laura put in the link for the onboarding, but if you just go to the ACIS webpage, it's going to be right there in front of you, and you can find it there also. Questions?
So we had a few questions, Dr. Lewis, that I think are kind of quick answers around the populations. So will there be any recommendations for children, pregnant women, or immunocompromised to receive any of these vaccines that you know of yet?
We are waiting to see what ACIP will say about immunocompromised people. They are, pregnant women and children will not be recommended to get this vaccine, possibly 16 and above. There are trials that are going on starting in children right now. Immunocompromised people with inactivated vaccines can tolerate them. We'll just have to see what ACIP says about the non-replicating viruses, and probably the measles vaccine, Merck's measles, SARS vaccine would not be used in immunocompromised. Other questions?
And if you have a question, go ahead and unmute and ask questions too, yeah.
You didn't answer the question about pregnant women taking the vaccine.
Yeah, pregnant women, we'll have to see what ACIP and FDA says, but there has not been any studies in pregnant women. So I expect they will say not to use it in pregnant women.
I have two questions. One is, and I think I know, I can guess the answer to one is the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. Once the injection occurs, I assume that the mRNA eventually degrades and it's no longer, your body's no longer producing spike proteins, which is why you need a second dose.
Yes, yes, and that happens. mRNA is very fragile, and so you just have to be really careful even when you're diluting the Pfizer. You don't want to shake it, you know, you just, and there are enzymes in the cells that break down mRNA because the DNA is always sending mRNA out into the cell, and there has to be a way to break down mRNA. And yes, it does, it disappears.
So it's stirred, not shaking.
Yeah.
The second question is, that's the mRNA virus going straight to mRNA. First of all, it seems like a cleaner methodology, actually. Is there any reason, since it's novel, to have any concerns that this vaccine that we might have, is there any kind of theoretical thing that we should be looking for?
The theoretical is just the unknown. If you think about it, though, we use measles vaccine and varicella vaccine all the time, and they're attenuated, but they're live. And the way they get immunity is by replicating. So our bodies are full of viral RNA and DNA, not just a tiny little segment, but the full DNA and RNA of these viruses and viral proteins as they go from cell to cell to cell to cell. So this is just a tiny little piece of RNA that just, doesn't go from cell to cell and only makes spike protein. So I'm not a scientist has to say, we'll have to wait and see. Me, I say, boy, this is clean, give it to me.
So I have a question, is when they do the vaccine, when people get the vaccine, do they have to stay away from other people for any length of time? So can they spread the disease from the vaccine? It is not a live vaccine?
It is the Merck measles vaccine is a live attenuated with SARS, the SARS protein sticking out of it. But you can't pass measles virus from person to person after you've been vaccinated. And these other, all of these other types are either inactivated, they're not live. The non-replicating viral vectors just stay in the cell. They get on in there, they replicate once, they're not going on. So I see no way that they could be spread from person to person. Very different from the oral polio vaccine, where there is potential spread person to person.
Dr. Lewis, it's Rebecca. We are hearing from a lot of folks, it's sort of a conspiracy theory that because it's mRNA, people are worried that it's going to integrate into the DNA. Could you talk folks through how to answer that question and why it doesn't enter the nucleus?
mRNA just stays outside of the nucleus of a cell, and takes over the cell's protein making apparatus, but does not go into the nucleus where there is DNA. And so there is no way that RNA can get into the nucleus in the first place, and RNA doesn't incorporate into DNA in the second place. So the words are scary to people who do not understand, viruses and cells and genetic material, but they don't have to worry. They're allowed to worry, but get the vaccine and they'll find out they're protected and it won't cause any long-term problems.
There's a question in the chat about, will patients born before 1960 who don't recall ever having measles, should they not get that Merck one, but the rest of the vaccines would be okay?
The Merck one is going to take a while to come out. The ones who, I had measles, but I couldn't prove it, so I got a measles vaccine. You don't, even if you've had an illness before, that's I can't think of any way that that's a contraindication to getting revaccinated. So no, that's not going to be a problem. And each time with each of these vaccines that come out, there is going to be specific instructions from the FDA on how to use it and from ACIP on how to use it. And so we're going to have the challenge of keeping track of who gets which vaccine and make sure they get the second dose of the same vaccine. So it's number one, in your CDC provider agreement to be able to give the vaccine, you say, I will report this vaccine to ACIS. Number two, we've got to know what was the first dose for the manufacturer for that first dose, so we give them the proper second dose, because mixing and matching has not been studied at all. Plus, in the CDC ancillary kit, there will be a card that needs to be given to people to say, you got this manufacturer vaccine, you need a second dose. But people lose those cards.
Yeah, I think that's a really important reminder too, that each of these vaccines is going to come with its own FDA licensure, its own ACIP approval, its own MMWR, publication. So
its own storage and handling.
right.
Pfizer is the only one that's going to need dry ice, but some are going to be frozen, like it'll be, and then some are just going to be refrigerator temperature, maybe room temperature.
And did you have any comments on the UK's recommendation to avoid vaccination for patients with severe
That is so good. I am not aware whether that was discussed today at the FDA. And so we'll be interested to see what the emergency use authorization says and what ACIP says. I'm sure that they will address that issue.
Thanks. So stay tuned.
So I saw something about cost, and the vaccines will be provided free of charge to everyone. The administration fee should be billed to the insurance company. If people do not have insurance, federal government has a fund to reimburse practitioners for the administration fee. But the ancillary supplies that come along with the vaccine, there will be no charge for that. But providers are not allowed to charge patients for this. Once there is the overabundance of vaccine, we'll get to a point that the manufacturers will take it over as just a regular routine vaccine. We don't know yet if we're going to need booster doses like every year, like with influenza. We just don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see.
Does anyone else have questions for Dr. Lewis? We had one on distribution that came through the chat, and I don't know if you or Dr. Sonnenschein might be able to speak to it, but will the rural areas get Moderna because of those storage and handling struggles with Pfizer? Do either of you know that, or is that something we need to track down?
What the state health department does is to set up the registration and communicate with CDC, and CDC will say, you have so much of Pfizer coming to you this week. You have so much of Moderna coming to you. And then there will be local allocators. There will be county health departments will serve as their local allocators. And then we have 3 tribes that are working with the state. And it will be those county health departments or the tribes that decide, and there will be, out of that CDC allocation, there will be the proportional distribution to the counties. And then county health officer gets to say, okay, we want Pfizer to go here, we want Moderna to go there. And so it's very possible. And then as we get more vaccine, people can start choosing. At the beginning, there's probably not going to be as much of a choice. As we get more and more vaccines, it's expected there'll be a choice, but it's the county health department's decision as to which vaccine gets allocated where.
So I will say that for the initial distributions, there were some county health departments that did not have the infrastructure, the ultra cold freezers, or really the numbers of people to vaccinate in order to be able to vaccinate 1,000 people at a time, because the minimum shipment for Pfizer is about 995. So those health departments, some of them elected not to get the Pfizer and got Moderna instead. And Maricopa County is disproportionately taking Pfizer vaccine for those counties. And we have elected to only use Pfizer in our regional pods. And those regional pods, there's 5 of them in Maricopa County. That's what we're using just for phase 1A, which applies to almost everyone on this call. That's where you all as healthcare providers will get vaccinated. And then as we move into phase 1B, we'll start having private providers, pharmacies, FQHCs, and others vaccinate as well. And then there will be more vaccine types available. That's just for Maricopa County.
Oh, thank you.
Dr. Lewis, is there a certain time you need to wait to vaccinate somebody who has active COVID? I mean, as soon as they're done with their disease, can they receive the vaccine?
I will wait to see what ACIP says about that. In general, we don't know how long protection from disease lasts. And the discussions I have heard at ACIP is probably say, go ahead and vaccinate. Now, if you have 100 doses and you have 200 people to immunize, you would immunize people who, haven't had COVID. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, I know that there's a lot of other questions coming in. If you have additional questions, continue to put those in the chat. We will try to get those answered and email you individually what the answers are to your additional questions, and then we'll create like a Q&A sheet to send out to this group. So thank you, Dr. Lois. We're so lucky to have you on our vaccine team. So, but I do want to turn it off to Dr. Bob, and he's going to discuss with you all how do you talk to people about the vaccine. So Dr. Bob, and I think you are going to share your own screen. So
yes, can I do that now? Let's do that. Make sure this works. Okay. All right. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm going to fly through this as fast as I possibly can because this part of it is really more about you than me. And I'm really interested in hearing from you guys what you're already hearing from some of your patients. But I want to start this off not just about what we should be telling patients, but things to keep in mind for ourselves as well, so that we're not surprised as this rolls out. First off, we are in a heck of a state right now. you all know the surge is in some ways mind-blowing. If you look at Arizona data, this is hospitalization data, you can see that you've got a trend here that gets concerning to all of us. And importantly, when the modelers look at this data and they project what's going to happen in the future, that green line right there in the middle that shows exceeding overall hospital capacity sometime in January is based on no holiday increase in exposure and transmission, which none of us think is probably very accurate. The effect from Thanksgiving, the effect from any particular change in behavior is going to take at least a couple weeks to begin to show up in the statistical data that you guys see all the time. And so we would only just now begin to see the impact of Thanksgiving. We assume it will bump us even higher to higher rates of transmission. We don't know for sure, but you look at what that brown line shooting upwards looks like, and we should all be really concerned about this. So knowing that we're in a really bad place right now as we begin to use vaccine, you gotta know you can't turn this around quickly. It's gonna take a significant amount of time. I saw a really interesting modeling that was done that showed if we had vaccine that was only about half as effective as what these first two vaccines look like, but we were able to introduce it at a rate that we had of transmission back in September, even with much less effective vaccine, we'd expect maybe 60,000 more deaths before we get to herd immunity and turn this thing around. But given where we are now, even with damn good vaccine, it is going to take us so long to get to the point of herd immunity and plateauing off and then decreasing this, that over the next 6 months, they're projecting another 160,000 deaths in this country. And that, again, doesn't take into account a holiday period surge, which I'm afraid of. What that means is, in practical terms, people are going to be waiting for a while for their turn in line. If you look just at our phase 1A work, just healthcare workers and those in long-term care, you're pushing 500,000 individuals at a time, and we only expect less than 400,000 doses of vaccine to get to us by the end of December. And don't forget, it's 2 doses per patient. So we will be well into January before we get through phase 1A. And besides those who are technically in phase 1A, there have been public statements made that I'm sure give many others the impression that they're going to be first in line, such as teachers. So it is going to take several months before we begin to see the effect of herd immunity. Think about when you get into the next phases of vaccine, and people have said, well, perhaps essential workers will be the very next in line, which would be a good thing in my estimation, but that's most of the Arizona workforce. So that's a huge chunk of our population. It will take significant time to get through those, even when you're looking just at those who are ready to step up and accept the vaccine. So point number 1 for your patients. I know it's been a long slog, but it's going to be a lot longer. And we have to keep up all the social mitigation measures that we have in place right now. even after people have been vaccinated. It's something that's important that they don't walk out of your office or vaccine clinic thinking is that, thank God I've gotten my second dose of vaccine, I can rip this mask off. Because for a while, you're still going to be exposed to this virus in the community, and you're still going to need the extra protection afforded you by masking as well as the immunization. Okay. Another thing that people should be aware of, and your patients should be aware of, is that all these recommendations, there were lots of good questions asked of Dr. Lewis this evening, all of it's going to change. The types of vaccine that get approved, as you saw, are going to evolve. The dosage schedule may change as we learn more. Yeah, you didn't get your second dose after 21 days. Just how late can you get it without having to restart? We'll learn that as we go along. There were questions asked about how young people can get the vaccine. The FDA committee just today recommended 16 years and above because there isn't yet good study data for younger populations. There are going to be questions about pregnant women, questions about people with other sorts of conditions, and it's all going to change over time. Even our understanding about decrease of transmission to others for people who have breakthrough infection after they've gotten vaccine, we're going to learn that too. It doesn't mean we don't know what we're doing as a science. That's how science works. We're learning as we go along. But I guarantee you that vaccine skeptics or people who are just hesitant and scared are going to look at all these changing recommendations and think that it indicates that the science isn't there when it is. Okay. The main concern many people are going to have about this is about safety. So I just want to point a few things out, and you see this elsewhere, and I saw it in the chat box earlier too. And I heard Dr. Lewis say it as well. But Warp Speed, Operation Warp Speed, didn't skip steps. It just ran them simultaneously. Usually, if you're in drug or vaccine production business, there's no way you're starting your phase 3 trial before you finish the others. And there's certainly no way that you're manufacturing vaccine in large amounts just on the off chance you get it approved. So we did things that for financial reasons usually aren't done together. But that's one big reason why it happened so fast, as well as all the basic science research that had been done already going into this. The other thing from a safety standpoint that I think is really going to help is that by the time most of your patients are eligible for any of the vaccine, there will be a lot of people in phase 1A, us among them, who have already gotten it. And so people will see from firsthand experience that they're not guinea pigs, that they're not the first ones in line. You do have to prepare people for likely side effects. I have seen reports, and I haven't looked at all the data, but I've seen reports of 40-some% reporting some level of fatigue or malaise, constitutional symptoms, and more than 10% of folks develop a fever. I know that's going to bother people, but it means it's working. It's your immune system kicking into gear that you're feeling. And that's way preferable to either having to roll the dice with COVID disease. And it's certainly preferable for us to hit herd immunity with this so that we can get back to some kind of normal life. And the last thing I want to say about safety, just to be aware is going to happen. I saw questions about, I heard questions to Dr. Lewis about What do we think about the severe allergic reactions being contraindications? Yeah, we'll wait for ACIP to say, but, and it'll probably vary for different vaccines coming down the line too. People with serious allergies may be told not to get the first versions out, but get one that's coming up the pike later. But if it's considered an absolute contraindication, we're in trouble, because there are 50 million Americans walking around who have had an EpiPen prescribed. And if we take 50 million people off the top of this, I don't see how we ever get to herd immunity on a population-wide basis. So I'm hoping there's some wiggle room in there somewhere. And the other thing I just want to point out, as Jen Tinney pointed out to me just the other day, thanks, Jen, I hadn't thought of it. The very first phase, phase 1A, it's rolling out to long-term care centers. Many residents in long-term care centers are going to suffer serious events because of why they're in the long-term care center. There will be heart attacks, there will be strokes, there will be organ failure. And to the extent that there's a temporal link, that they get the vaccine before they have their stroke that they may have had anyway, that stuff's going to get reported into VAERS. And even when later statisticians and epidemiologists run the numbers and say, nope, there wasn't an increased rate of those outcomes in people who were vaccinated, it's not going to matter. It's going to fuel the arguments among those who would like you to think that this stuff is really dangerous. They're going to quote fatality rates, which are simply temporal associations, not because of the vaccine. So here's my bottom line recommendations is for you, if you're going to be using vaccine, to accept whatever you can get, and for your patients to take whatever is available to them. Make it routine, make it as routine as possible. Use an opt-out appointment system. It gets people in better. Use reminders and recalls. It gets people in better. Remind them that they're not going to be instantly protected as soon as they get their vaccine. It takes a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks for your body to build antibodies. And as I saw in Dr. Lewis's data, even further out, you get better response. And do the thing for us that you guys do the best, which we can't do on a big, mass population basis. Do some reflective listening. Ask patients if they're reluctant to get this vaccine, what their concerns are, so you can address what's really bothering them. So summary, this isn't a quick fix. Life is going to be in this alternate universe we're all living in for several more months. That doesn't mean the vaccine isn't working. It's just going to take that long to get enough of us immune to build herd immunity. Got to keep up all the other precautions we've already done. I'm going to take whatever vaccine is offered to me the first chance I get. Expect there to be side effects, and please, please, please be advocates for this whole thing. We have got to we got to build herd immunity to get out of this. And with that, I'll shut up and let Rebecca tell me.
Well, I'm glad that you didn't listen to us and instead really painted that picture of what to expect in the next few months, because I think that that's really, really critical. And we just want to remind you, we're not sure if it would be helpful to do future webinars or not for this group of healthcare providers, because we don't want to be duplicating efforts if you're getting this kind of information from other sources. So if you could just take that poll really quickly. I think that what is most important and what we really want you to walk away with today is you will be the reason how we get out of this pandemic, because you are the ones who will vaccinate with confidence your patients. And regular people might, like me, listen to our doctors and our nurses and our healthcare providers. And we really need you to make sure that you have all of the questions answered for you to understand it and feel confident receiving the vaccine so that you can recommend the vaccine. So no questions are silly. We need you to call us out and tell us when we're not giving you the right information, and just be able to stay in touch with us, because the vaccine is safe. Science was not, the scientific method was protected in the development of this vaccine, and we really need you to get the vaccine when it's available to you and recommend it too. So, and it looks like as these polling results are coming in, most people are saying yes. I think that we might need another web conference. Chat in ideas for what those topics would be. And tonight or tomorrow, we'll send you like a 3-question survey evaluation, and you can give us ideas there too. So thank you all so much. Our speakers, thank you. Our dream team, vaccine dream team, we love you guys. And we really love all of you healthcare providers too. Thank you for all you're doing and in these times. And we really appreciate you. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, Dr. Bob.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. Sorry I didn't leave more time for questions. It flew.
Yeah, well,
Sorry, we didn't leave you more time for questions.
FLEW.
Oh,
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, Rebecca, if anybody sends a chat question or anything that you want to shoot my way, that's fine.
okay, that sounds great. Thank you.
All right. Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. Trying to figure out how to get out of this.
Thanks, Dr. Hunt.
I'm gonna save that.
Exit. There it is.
All right, and I'm gonna go ahead and close out the thing too. So, bye everyone. Thank you so much. Oh, and we will. Someone's chatting in about the recording. I think we'll probably email it to you too next week.
Yeah, we'll get the slides together in a summary and a link to the recording. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.